Welcome to Humanist Views, a program where we look at current issues from a humanist point of view. I'm Scott Lohman. On tonight's program, we're going to go a little more philosophical and sort of just not quite on current issues or science or the hard stuff, but look at something a little more fun, a little more human. We're going to take a look at the importance of story in human lives and how that's been with us for a very long time and how it's important for a lot of people and how some people think maybe life should be a story rather than just whatever it ends up being. So my guest tonight is Stephanie Zvan. And Stephanie is a blogger and a writer, besides doing other things with life.
Yes.
Yes, and you blog at Almost Diamonds at Free Thought Blogs.
Correct.
Yes, and you also talk about story on weekends. So let's just sort of go on what's your interest, and then we'll move back and look at things.
I have done a certain amount of science fiction and fantasy writing. Most of it unpublished, although I did publish one story in Nature. So
okay.
I have one professional sale to my credit.
That puts you ahead of me. But we all seem to be, you know, some of us, a lot of us, are, when we get interested in story, you also think you can get a feel for writing and for actually writing and discover that it's actually a lot harder than it looks.
It is.
The ones that know what they're doing make it look like anybody can do that.
Yep, and that's part of the, let's call it, magic of story.
Yeah. So what do you look for in a good story? Let's just start and see if we can define what it is.
For me, I want, I hate dystopic novels. Let's just go with that. I can handle it sometimes in short story length, but not in novel length. I don't necessarily want, cheerful, happy strawberry shortcake kind of fiction, but I at least want something where everything isn't hopeless.
Yes. Yeah, so moving away from, which is sort of a current trend right now, there is a lot of dystopia around. I read a lot of science fiction, and right now, even in the mainstream science fiction, we're seeing a little more dystopia, but I think it more reflects sort of a feeling of what people are getting from society in general.
I agree, that's probably the case.
Yeah, fiction does still tend to reflect reality, even though we're sort of using it many times to talk about reality.
Although I also expect with things getting as bad as they have and the outlook on things like global warming getting a little more bleak, we're going to get a lot more escapist literature pretty soon too. Well,
there is that. We do sometimes see it sort of split off.
Yes.
But right now, say in young adults, we're having a big run on dystopias, but they are doing a lot more fantasy things than I think they did in the past, or at least that's my feeling.
I think in the past, a lot of fantasy that was written completely appropriately for young adults was classified as adult fiction. Most people my age grew up on Anne McCaffrey's work, and that was never really classed as young adult. That was classed as adult fiction. There's sex in it.
Definitely, yep.
Mm-hmm. So I think we're recognizing more that young adults can handle more than we gave them credit for.
Yeah, you can look at, the Harry Potter series is a good example of that. Even though the characters were younger, it was dealing with some very adult themes throughout the series.
It was. Although, in a lot of ways, the characters were not necessarily dealing with those themes. The world was.
Yeah, they were moving them within there, because some storylines will do that, and others have their character do that. Because I know one of the aspects of one of my favorite story types is Star Trek, and when it came on the air, it was one of the first shows to interweave into the theme of the story what they wanted to talk about, rather than having lawyers discuss a conflict. So they were able to do that. So is that something that appeals to you when they're able to do it like that, or more of just a good romp?
Well, I have to admit this now, and if you end the show, I'll understand. I'm not a huge Star Trek fan.
That's okay.
But there are, episodic science fiction that I enjoyed, particularly Stargate SG-1.
Okay.
And they did some of that. They brought up issues because it was a military crew that was part of, that was basically running the show. They brought up some issues of how military force is used. They were certainly topical on the question of how the military and the government the rest of the government interact, that kind of thing. So they certainly were not a topic of the week kind of show, but they did bring that in.
Yeah, they were able to interweave that, as well as looking at having secret use of advanced technology, and how that goes in there, as well as dealing with, alien encounters and the fact that they're not all cuddly out there.
Yep, and abuse of advanced technology, particularly secret advanced technology.
Yes, that they did a nice job of looking at that, which talks about implications in the real world in that part.
Yes, I think maybe more of us should go back and watch that these days.
Yes, definitely keep an eye on those things, especially the old computers being able to do lots of things.
Yes.
So as we look at how humans interact with story, I mean, we've got movies and plays that have been going on for a very long time, but it also goes all the way back to sitting around the campfire. And most will look at those stories as probably just for amusement, as well as using them to teach. Do you think that that's one of the reasons that some people will go for having set characters, looking at the story stylings from, say, the medieval times when they had the Theater dell'arte and those type of things?
I'm always a little hesitant to read too much meaning into what kinds of stories people tell, because they are very much set within a culture, which can both perhaps tell us a lot about the culture, but at the same time can de-emphasize the importance of any particular element. It's there in a story because every story has that element in it. So we certainly do use repetition of form. We use repetition of character types, all that sort of thing. But I'm not sure how much of it is because those things are important and how much of it is because having a framework, a mental framework in which to fit story makes story easier to understand.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot to that latter point on that, because if you're looking for certain things, then you know that X will follow Y, and you can sort of structure it that way. You can even see that in the high art of opera, where they've got story structures a certain way that can be easily then satirized, where Warner Brothers can take a 12-hour opera and condense it to 6 minutes.
Yes.
Brilliantly showing off how you can look at those themes.
Yep. And I think doing that, and the fact that we tend to get rehearsed elements in pretty much any culture, tells us a little bit in general about what story is about, and I think really it's just the attempt to understand our experiences, to fit them into some kind of pattern of meaning. We certainly see that that's an important part of religious storytelling. So, but I think that's the case with any other kind of story as well.
Yeah, because we notice in religion a lot, it goes back a long way with us, but it's also started with explaining why there was thunder and lightning, but then could have moved on to explaining how humans can interact in small tribal groups as well.
Oh yeah, and there are some great stories about dealing with gods and how humans manage their interactions with gods. For example, the story in which Zeus was demanded some kind of tribute and of animal flesh, and was given two choices, and one was a pile of meat covered basically with skins and offal, and one was a pile of skins and offal covered with some nice little bits of meat. And of course, Zeus chose that one, which was much better for humans. Yeah, and so they would do that a lot. And what's fun is you can see that cross-culturally when they're using different story types with different religious backgrounds. Even going back to Native Americans with their different styles of gods. And I am not as familiar with those mythologies, in part because the style of story is so foreign to mine that I didn't read a lot of them as a child.
Yeah, I hadn't either, but you can see they even had some of the same sort of god themes that we see even from European societies with trickster gods and those type of themes, taking a look that, we're telling these stories about the gods, but the universe doesn't seem to conform to the stories.
Yes.
So we've seen, some people like to, especially, looking at social media and how people use that, trying to sort of make themselves as stars in their own stories. Do you think this is something that's good for human beings, or is it, say, another way of dealing with stress in the way just surviving can be some days?
I think it's probably some of both. I think social media and that tendency is doing an amazing job of getting more stories from more people, more different stories, different people told and heard. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very good for us because when when most of our storytelling is channeled through a few publishers, that can really restrict whose stories are told. So I think everybody having access to being able to tell their own stories is a great thing. I don't necessarily think that the tendency to try to understand your life as a story is always a good idea, however.
Yeah, that can be tricky because life doesn't really conform that way.
Well, and some of the tropes that we have in our current storytelling are horrendous if you actually stop and think about them. The romantic comedy in which the female lead is pursued by the male lead despite being completely disinterested is a lovely description of harassment in the real world. Mm-hmm. It only works on the screen.
True.
So trying to understand your own interaction with other people in light of that trope is probably a really bad idea.
Yeah, definitely on that. So we can see, and the other thing about the net is that more people can publish, which gives us a wider spectrum of things, and as opposed to book publishers just taking what managed to hit the quality levels they were looking for. That makes it for much more interesting adventures when you're looking for stuff to read.
It does, and I think it's also broadening our ideas of story again a bit. Mm-hmm. Particularly when you're looking at people who are blogging, they're telling you a story that doesn't necessarily have an end, which it's been a while since we've had real serials, mm-hmm. particularly in American media, aside from soap operas.
True. Yeah, because that was one of the big things with the written genre, when like Charles Dickens and Mark Twain would serialize things in newspapers. Yep. So that is, and there it can be things of real life, or it can be people just writing what they want. Yep. So that gives us, a lot of different insights into people who never, since for most of human history, at least going back a couple of centuries, a vast majority of people were illiterate as opposed to being literate. And do you think that as we become more literate societies, does that see where, things that makes for a better society when we've got more people who can read and write and communicate that way, or does it, depending on how you want to, structure higher, power structures in a society?
I think that goes back a bit to how many stories and whose stories get to be told now. Mm-hmm. And we have tools that don't necessarily require us to be literate. We have YouTube, we have mm-hmm. video recording these days is pretty cheap and easy. Mm-hmm. And even basic editing is cheap and easy these days. So it's not necessarily something we would have to do mm-hmm. in a literate or that requires literacy. But at the same time, that takes a lot more time. It's much easier, even though it's a different experience and you lose a little bit by it, mm-hmm. Getting somebody's story in written form. That takes up a whole lot less time. So there are trade-offs there as well.
Yeah, there are interesting trade-offs. Yeah, the whole YouTube phenomenon, especially ones younger than us, really like that. And you can see whole subgenres of things popping up on people that will do longer forms or have mastered the 5-minute piece that is quick to easy to digest.
Yep.
And we can see, across from the religious end of the spectrum all the way to the free thought spectrum of people being able to do pieces and interact with other humans that way that, you couldn't in the old print days.
Yes, although YouTube's comments are not necessarily optimized for interaction, I would say.
No, I would say not on that. There are other ways to interact that way and do that, because that's where you find a different side to humanity when it comes to comments on things.
Yes, though they're working on that.
Yeah, there's ways of exploring that. So if we're looking at, just our relationships as we look at how we create our stories, are we going to see some new formats coming in, or are we still just going to find variations on the stories that we've been using in the past?
I think we'll always see innovation, but looking at it from here, it's really hard to specifically predict that.
Definitely.
Simply because if we knew what it was, it would be on the way already. So I think we'll definitely see some kinds of innovation. We're certainly seeing people working at innovation. The short film has become a big thing again after being, there were
extinct for a while.
There were decades when they had trouble finding enough films to nominate for Oscars in the category. So it's certainly resurrecting some styles of story.
Yeah, because it is interesting, because there with the technology we've got, it's accessible down to quite a few more people at that, being able to do that, and you can experiment and not have to worry about developing costs for film. So your learning curve is much better when all you've wasted is a couple hours of your day creating something going, oh, that didn't work, but at least I've learned X, Y, and Z don't.
Yep. Although we will also find that professional storytellers of the current mold, and we've been seeing this for several years, have to change their models somewhat, simply because there is so much free content out there, because people get used to getting their content delivered electronically, because publishers have taken a big hit with the internet. Anybody from news publishers to, I think we're probably seeing it a little bit in film, but there the costs of production have come down so much that small producers are still, I think, doing okay. But so we may see innovation just from competition based on that.
And that'll make things really interesting, even as we find new ways of distributing our content, because when we were growing up, there were 3 channels and sometimes 4 that you had to choose from, and that took a lot of money, time, and being in the right place to be able to distribute your video product. And now with a login in and a password, you can then put your own material out there and promote it yourself. So it does broaden that a whole lot.
Yeah, and even the professional television shows that I watch, I have no idea whether they've actually aired on a television station or whether they're just being delivered directly to my television. So that's definitely changing things.
Yeah, so we're getting things different. So as we look at how we as human beings like to interact, and just the fact that this goes so far back into our history, we still use it for a wide variety of purposes, from teaching to fun to interaction. It's kind of the fun aspects of as new, like when you start reading to your kids, it's interesting to see what they catch on to. Even though some of those stories have been around for a long time, you still can find new ones that get the kids interested.
Yep.
So as the internet grows and people get more interacting, is this going to help us sort of learn to communicate much better, even though it's still kind of crazy out there?
I think it's already teaching a certain number of us to communicate a lot better. It's certainly, kids these days spend so much more time writing between emails and text messages. And hey, if you don't like the language, that's tough. That's still language. And kids are doing it pretty well.
And yeah, language has always been in flux.
You can always change the way you spell a word.
Yes.
So kids are doing an awful lot more writing. They're blogging. They're getting on Facebook and telling a little story of what happened during their day. So I think we are possibly training up a generation of just more story literate kids these days.
And that I think is going to be a good thing, because as it's available across the world, around the world, we'll have better interactions with other cultures on that part as people start checking out the different cultures, and the fact that we can use the internet machine to even translate things.
Yes. Yeah, translation should be interesting. I'm not going to hold out high hopes for it until YouTube can actually caption videos properly. But yeah, that should be interesting. I think more interesting will be just the effects that people in various political movements have, because they are being trained in story. They're going to be much better at getting their messages across, which should be very interesting.
Yeah, and especially since they have different ways of getting their message across in political campaigns, even with the case of there being almost no limits in how much cash some people can spend on doing political campaigning. There are still other ways of organizing at the grassroots, when you can create a quick YouTube channel or video that before wouldn't make it because you didn't have the funds to put it on a TV station.
Well, and the interesting thing about that is that money can't really buy story.
Correct.
It can buy you access to good storytellers. It can perhaps buy you a certain amount of audience, but you still have to have a compelling story. I wasn't thinking as much in terms of political campaigns, though, as activist groups.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So the fact that there are a bunch of atheists and humanists out there on the internet telling their stories has made a huge difference, I think, in the last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I believe so as well, because we're seeing a lot more people finding our story, because when I was growing up, I grew up in a small town, and communications was books, radio, television, and magazines. And there wasn't this thing where you could go find easily other non-believers, especially when you're stuck in a small town.
Well, and even more importantly, believers can now find non-believers. It used to be that basically the people who were talking about atheists were standing up in a pulpit on Sunday, and they were the one commanding everybody's idea of what non-believers were like. And with a whole bunch of non-believers out there telling their own stories, they don't have that kind of control anymore. Yeah,
that's where I think that ability for us to be able to get our stories out there is allowing more people to realize, he's a lot like me, or she's a lot like me. And I can see what happens when you start asking those questions. And I think that's helping our cause a whole lot, because now people have access to the information that we never used to. Because with your blog talking about you talk about a wide variety of issues, from stuff on atheism and humanism, as well as working on gender issues and discrimination and all that stuff, that people can see that there's a broader interest on our spectrum, rather than just thinking, they just don't like the gods.
Yep. And so far I haven't actually found a baby eating blog, so that one may die yet.
Yeah, that we'll hopefully be able to get rid of that one down the line. Yep. So where can they find your blog?
I'm at freethoughtblogs.com/almostdiamonds, or if you go to Freethought Blogs on our main page, my blog is listed there, Almost Diamonds.
Yeah, and so, but you're also going to be involved with, we're taping this in the fall of the year, and there's going to be another online conference, which is a very cool thing. Yes,
and we made the brilliant plan of having it Super Bowl weekend.
Okay.
However, that's Sunday. Things will kick off Friday, and it'll be a pretty full weekend of a whole bunch of non-believers talking about a whole bunch of things that you just don't find at most conferences because, you don't know where those speakers are until you get to do something like this, or they can't come to you.
Yeah, and so, in this case, you can hook up a panel that's in 4 or 5 different parts of the country.
Or 4 or 5 different countries.
That too.
We've done that.
Oh, cool. So that should be a fun thing, and people can find that on Free Thought Blogs when it's ready to go.
Yes, they can.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Stephanie. It's been fun talking about this, even though it's a little bit of a broad subject and hard to nail down. There are still neat things about what we do as humans and telling our stories and reading others and the fun ones I like to create.
I'm glad to have been here.
So for more information on us, the Humanists of Minnesota, you can go to our website at humanistofmn.org. You can find previous editions of this program as well as copies of our newsletter and find out about events we've got going. We meet various times during the year, and we have other events other than just our monthly meetings. So come join us at that. We'd like to have you come meet us and join us. If you have ideas or topics you'd like to see us cover on this program in the future, you can contact us through the website. We'd be glad to hear from you. So thank you for joining me on this edition of Humanist Views. I'm Scott Lohman. Good night.